Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere, and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then, you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I feel like I've been having a lot more connection with my listeners through the Q&As and polls. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Hi, I'm Father Daniel Duplantis, a Catholic priest, martial artist, and host of the Karate Priest podcast. Have you ever wondered what the church teaches about different topics? Are you a martial arts enthusiast or just someone who wants to learn more about martial arts? I'd like to invite you to join me and many guests on my podcast as we cover topics of faith, everyday living, and martial arts on the Karate Priest podcast. Hello, and welcome back to A Catholic's Perspective with the Religious Hippie. As you can tell, I am not the religious hippie. This is Father Daniel Duplantis, the Karate Priest. And I'm here giving the introduction because Amber can't get her act together. Amber, how are you today?
It's been a long morning.
This is going to be my favorite introduction ever. I know it.
Well, this is the last episode of season 3. So I love how we usually start every season with each other and then we end it with each other. Today is just not the vibe. I've already had too much coffee. The caffeine is flowing through my veins. My brain cannot keep up with my mouth. It's not fun.
I mean, it's Valentine's Day. You probably got a little special somebody on the mind.
You know it.
Oh, yeah.
I wish people could see our faces right now. Well, today's episode, because it's the last episode of season 3, kind of sad, but season 4 is coming back in August of 2023. So fret not.
What?
I know. It seems like it was like yesterday when we started like this podcast, you know, the Religious Hippie and A Catholic's Perspective. Like it was actually like almost 4 years ago. Isn't that crazy? Well, 3 years ago. That's so insane.
Just over 3. No? Huh? Just over 2, because it was December or around November, December 2020 where we recorded our first episode together.
That's right.
Yep.
Just a little bit over like 2-ish. Yeah. But it's absolutely ridiculous to me. I'm like, what?
Time is flying.
Yes, it's just absolutely crazy. And today we're kind of just doing a review of, you know, what's kind of happened over the last, you know, couple months in 2022. And so I guess we'll start with you. I guess you got your tangsudo black belt. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So that was quite another accomplishment in my martial arts career. So just a little bit of background with that. Tangsudo is the predecessor art to Taekwondo. So just, very briefly, what happened was, if you go back to the early 20th century, Japan occupied the Korean peninsula from 1910 to 1945-ish, something like that, up through the end of World War II. And when they occupied Korea, the Japanese did not let the Koreans practice their native martial arts. They could only practice, if they were allowed to practice any arts, only allowed to practice the Japanese ones. So that would be karate and judo and things like that. So you had several Koreans who, traveled abroad. They left Korea during the occupation. They went to China, learned Kung Fu. They went to Japan and also learned karate. And then they came back to Korea after the war and opened up their own schools and were teaching. Essentially, most of them were teaching karate. They were teaching Japanese karate, but using Korean terminology, Korean commands, all that stuff. And so tangsudo was the name that was kind of given to that, which is a way of translating karate do. There's all kind of word plays between the names, between the Hangul and all the different languages, and but essentially what happened was in the wake of the Korean War, the South Korean government wanted to unify all these martial arts schools. into one unified curriculum and say, this is the Korean martial art to present to the world. And that's now what we know as Taekwondo. And so my background's in Taekwondo, and the organization we joined recently with our school is an organization that teaches both Taekwondo and tangsudo as one kind of continuous. This is what was taught by our Kwan before the merger and after the merger. And so I was given the opportunity to, if I learn their forms and learn their self-defense, and so a lot of our basics are the same, to test for my I thought I was testing for a first degree black belt in tangsudo, and they ended up surprising me with a double promotion after a grueling 4-hour examination, which was the most physically challenging thing I've ever done.
I remember you sending me pictures, and you had like bruises everywhere, and you were really sore.
Yep, I was. The day afterwards, riding back from Orlando, Florida, which is about a 9-hour drive to Louisiana. I could hardly move. It hurt to move anything. But it was so worth it. I totally do it all over again. Maybe not anytime soon, but I would. So that was just, a huge accomplishment to say now I have, black belts in Taekwondo and tangsudo. And now, trying to teach both system. And it's amazing just, how many more martial artists that has connected me to in learning tangsudo, to visit the local tangsudo school in Homa here in Louisiana, get to know them, and they've welcomed me with open arms as, kind of a go-between, between our two schools.
Right.
It's been really awesome. So we're trying to get together at some point to do some joint training with them. And so yeah, it's just really exciting, time for me in my martial arts career. And, and also I'll be testing for my 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo in June. So I'm kind of getting ready for that. So it's like shifting gears from tangsudo to Taekwondo and getting ready for that. And that will be here before I know it. But I mean, this is going to be like the real kind of crowning achievement of my martial arts career, because 4th degree for both Taekwondo and tangsudo is considered master status. And so it for us with Judo, Kwan, Taekwondo, we even get to wear a different uniform top. Our belt looks a little bit different. There's a red stripe that goes down the middle of the belt, which is kind of barred from the tangsudo tradition. And so this is a huge thing. I mean, I've had my sights set on 4th degree from the time I first started training in martial arts, because that's what my first instructor was a 4th degree. And so for me, it's like if I hit 4th, anything afterwards is just extra. The 4th has always been the goal. And I'm just months away from it at this point.
That's exciting. Now, Father Dan, do you have a specific martial artist that you look up to from a young age, or even now, like Bruce Lee, or I don't know anybody. I know Jackie Chan.
I do like Jackie Chan. He's the one that if I watched one growing up, it was Jackie Chan. And there's a bunch out there. I mean, Chuck Norris is one of the most famous Hollywood actors who did tangsudo. I mean, he's the one who made tangsudo popular in the United States.
Chuck Norris looks like a brick.
Yeah. So, but Jackie Chan was certainly, growing up watching his movies, was my favorite martial artist, because it's just, there was a humor in the way that he does things as well. But you could tell he's quite the athlete. He's quite the martial artist. And it was funny. Last night I was watching on TikTok, it was a little, video of him critiquing stunts. And if he thought they would pause a stunt video halfway through and he'd have to guess whether or not the stunt would fail or it would succeed. And it's funny to kind of watch him kind of break down and just watch him critique, he's not running fast enough. He's not going to make it, and so yeah, Jackie Chan, I think, would definitely be my favorite Hollywood martial artist.
Well, Jackie Chan, I believe he does all of his own stunts. Does he not?
Yeah, he does. Right.
Yeah. So that's like a whole other thing, because if you get hurt, you really have to know what you're doing. Stunt doubles are there to make sure that the actors don't get hurt, but if you're doing your own stunts, you better know what you're doing.
Oh yeah. And even for the Karate Kid and for Cobra Kai, Ralph Macchio, who plays Daniel LaRusso, Ralph, I don't think, besides in the movies, never did any kind of martial arts training outside of it. Whereas William Zabka, who plays Johnny Lawrence, got up to, I think, a green belt in tangsudo, but what's his name? Robert Ian Griffin, I think that's his name, Robert Ian Griffith. He's the guy who plays Terry Silver, and that actor actually has black belts in Kempo karate. and Taekwondo. So he is an actual professional martial artist, which is so cool to watch Terry Silver whenever he's in fight scenes, because he is a professionally trained martial artist.
Right. No, that's incredible. I was always intrigued by shows like that because those were shows like my dad grew up on, like the Karate Kid and stuff like that. And I always was interested in those shows. And I was, of course, in karate too growing up. It was good exercise and it taught us discipline and things like that. We were also in gymnastics and dance and soccer and like a lot of things to keep us active. But I really loved, Taekwondo. Am I saying that right?
Taekwondo.
Taekwondo.
Tai, whatever, whichever.
Taekwondo. So
Taekwondo.
I was in I was in that from a young age, and I really loved our instructors and things like that. But then we switched instructors, and they were really mean, and they pushed you a little bit too hard. And as a kid, it felt very uncomfortable. So we ended up quitting, which was kind of sad because I feel like I really could have gone far with it and gotten a black belt and things like that, because we did enjoy it. We got to run really fast, for warm-ups, and we got to do jumping jacks, and it, you learn things, and like how to hit properly, and how to hold a fist so you don't break your thumb, and just like all these fun things that as a kid I was really interested in. But the instructor really does make a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's been my experience growing up too, is just the different instructors I've had, and I've learned different things under each one. It's amazing how each one comes with a different perspective that, at each different, and it's funny because for every black belt I've ever tested for, whether it be my 3 degrees in Taekwondo or even now my tangsudo black belt, every black belt test was proctored for me by a different black belt, a different instructor. And there were certain things that I learned from each one throughout that process. And so it is unique to have, different instructors, and really helps you grow in so many ways.
We love that. And yeah, so it's a huge accomplishment that you got your tangsudo belt and everything like that. Now you're going for your 4th degree black belt. That's incredible.
I know.
And that's in June, you said, but in July, you're going on active duty, right?
Right, which is why the test is in June.
Which makes sense.
Having to wrap everything up in June. Yep.
Could you tell the listeners what active duty means, like what that would look like for you? Because I'm not sure if anybody knows exactly what that is.
Yeah, so the last almost 7 years now, I've been in the Air Force Reserve as a chaplain candidate. And so the way that has worked is when I got accepted to graduate seminary, is I commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. And so this was back in 2016 that I first commissioned. And, throughout your time in the seminary, you go to officer training school, you do a couple of follow-on tours. So I did a few of those. And then when you graduate the program, like you get ordained for your religious entity, and you get ordained, you graduate, they give you a certificate of completion for the candidate program. And then you can either go into the reserves as a chaplain, or you can go, you do like what I did, and you wait until you go active duty, because my agreement with the military archdiocese is that my diocese got me for the first 3 years, and then I would go active duty for at least 5. So 2023 was always the date that I had circled on my calendar almost for the last decade, knowing that this was the process. And it's amazing that, it's almost here. And so I will be released from my diocese to go full-time active duty in the Air Force. So I'll be full-time on a base, serving as a chaplain, as a priest. So basically I would be the pastor of the Catholic parish on base, and then doing all kind of unit visitations, things like that, a lot of counseling. But that will be my life and my vocation for at least the next 5 years. And that begins in July. So right now we're doing all the paperwork process, which is infuriating at sometimes, to say the least. Where it's a lot of forms to fill out. The big thing is that my scrolling is done, which is always the most time-consuming part of the process, where they actually put your name. I don't know if it's a physical scroll or a digital one, but there's some kind of scroll that they put your name on, and they fill up the scroll with names of every officer who's applying to be accessed onto some kind of duty in the Air Force. I don't know if any of the other branches do it this way, but that scroll is filled up, which is why it takes so long. They wait till the scroll is full. They send that scroll of names to the Armed Forces Committee in the Senate. The Senate committee reads those names in committee meeting, and then they vote to either approve or or not approve the scroll, which I think they always approve it anyway, as a whole. And then those officers are selected for their positions, and then you just got to finish out the paperwork process. Right now, I have to go do a couple of medical things to get up to date, but that's really the last big part of this, is to do medical and then just find out where I'm going, which I don't know yet. So that's everyone's big question. They know when I'm leaving, we just don't know where I'm going.
Right.
And so that's the big question. Certainly the most anxious thing I'm waiting to find out is where I'm going. And because I'm going to have to start making arrangements once I figure that out, start house shopping, which is something most priests don't ever have to do. Do I live on base or live off base? I'll have that choice. I have to actually, depending on what housing I get, I'm going to have to buy things like pots and pans and stuff, which I'm normally used to my rectory kitchens already having and not having to buy all that stuff. So I'm going to be living by myself for the most part. So there's a lot of things that most ordinary priests are, don't have to worry about that I'm going to have to start looking into. So it's kind of exciting. At the same time, it's making me very anxious of, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to do all this, But, thankfully I have several good priests who are already on active duty to kind of walk me through this process, give me tips along the way. And so, yeah, that's about where I'm at with that.
Yeah, I was going to say the anticipation of it all is probably what's more scary than the actual prospect of having to do it itself. I know that we've talked on our previous episode about, Catholics in the military. We talked about your experience and everything like that. Do you know roughly like how many soldiers to priests there are? Because I know there is a huge decline in Catholic chaplains in military bases. Like, they're the most needed.
Right. I want to say it's, oh gosh, 1,000 servicemen for every one Catholic priest who's on active.
There's a
And
lot.
that's just servicemen. That's not including their families. I think that's the number. It could be even more than that. But like, one of the last numbers I heard was like 25% of the entire armed forces is Roman Catholic, but only only is it like 6% of the chaplain corps is Catholic priests. Like, the number's pretty bad.
Wow.
And like, you would want your chaplain corps to be proportional to the number of Catholics, and it's just, we're not there.
Right.
So it's definitely a huge need. But that being said, Catholic parishes on military bases are some of your best thriving Catholic communities, at least in the United States, because they know how much faith means to them. They know the importance of receiving the sacraments. They've seen the difference when they get deployed downrange and they come back, and the difference that just a couple of masses makes if they get it, or if they have a priest on that deployment, the difference that makes. And so it is a huge ministerial need. And even though we have a shortage of priests in the United States, that shortage is felt probably most acutely on active duty.
Right. Well, especially because when, I'm not sure if you're going to be sent out to like the field or anything like that, specifically like in action type thing, but I mean, it could be a possibility if I'm not wrong, but the thing is that I was really like into World War II and World War I growing up, and, learning about these Catholic priests that would save people in gunfire. They would be getting shot at, and they would try to bring people or give them last rites, while they were in crossfire. And I think it's a very noble cause. And do you think the fact that not enough priests know about it, or maybe they're too afraid to go into the military, or maybe it's just, I mean, I want to know why there's just like such a decline of like Catholic chaplains in the military.
It's a lot of factors. So right after 9/11, there was a surge. There was definitely a surge because there was a surge in all kind of military fields. There was a desire, there was a resurgence in patriotism in general, and more people signed up to serve in the wake of 9/11. But since then, as the war on terror was declining, so was the chaplain corps, well, at least the Catholic priests in the chaplain corps. But certainly also just with numbers of priests and vocations. So you have to look at, first and foremost, a lot of dioceses are short on priests. We're getting to the point in my diocese where, we're certainly getting stretched with who we have. Like I'm as an associate pastor, I am constantly being asked, to cover masses for priests when they go on vacation or go on retreat, because we don't have many associate pastors like me at this point. There's not that many of us to go around to cover when our pastors are covering everything else at the parish. So there's that. There's just the shortage in general. Perhaps there's an unwillingness of priests who just never really thought about it or just don't think it's important. There's some priests who would love to do it, but they're not qualified. They're not like medically qualified. They wouldn't be able to clear physicals and things like that. It is a very physically demanding job. Or even sometimes just bishops not being willing to send guys. And some bishops are so stretched in their own dioceses, with the needs that they have to put for their parishes. Like we have a diocese in Louisiana right now that there are several priests who have 3 parishes to pastor. Wow. And that's not just one priest in that diocese, it's several priests who are in that predicament, so there are some dioceses that just really cannot afford to give up a priest, because that means that perhaps 3 parishes won't have a pastor.
Which is so sad, because if you think about it, back in like the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when I look at the statistics, then it was like 12 priests for 1 parish, and now it's like 1 priest for 12 parishes. It's so heartbreaking to see such a decline in the religious life. And I mean, part of that could be because, we live in just such a worldly type of world, and it's so accessible now that people don't know how to suffer well. Maybe people don't have access to Catholicism because they were raised, religionless, so to speak. Millennials have started doing that. They don't raise their children with a religion because they had religion pushed on them, and they quote unquote don't want to terrorize their kids with religion. So these kids aren't even brought up knowing about God. And I do believe that when God calls somebody to the priesthood, whether they were raised Christian or not, they will find their way. But the thing is that I think it's more difficult today than ever to be a priest or religious, a nun, a sister, anything else. And I see a lot of convents absolutely thriving, but not the priesthood. Have you noticed that too, or is that just in my area?
I think it depends on the area too. It's certainly there are some dioceses right now who are doing really phenomenal in terms of number of seminarians, and then there are just some that are not, and a lot of it is just making the resources available. A lot of it is helping guys and walking with guys through that process of discernment and giving them the resources there. So, I mean, it's a multifaceted problem that we're facing right now, but I think, what we're seeing in the priesthood right now is very encouraging going forward. At least in my diocese, we did not have very many ordinations at all in the first decade of the 2000s. But since 2010, we've ordained, seems like almost half the active priests in our diocese.
Wow.
So we had a big boom in the last decade. And it was beautiful, so when we're trying to continue that trajectory going forward, and, but not every diocese has that. So.
Right. And I think it's interesting because my parish at Canchis, they were really struggling for a while trying to get, people to become priests. And I remember back in, I think it was 2008, they had like 12 novices or something drop out because they just couldn't do it. But now they're like thriving. In fact, they're thriving so much that they have to split the canons regular between 3 different parishes. So they kind of like rotate. They do this rotational thing because there's so many of them, where they're at Canchis, and then they go to Volo, and then they go to Springfield, and then they come back to Canchis. So it's like every 6 months to a year, they rotate people out, just to help, keep, so that the priests can get, a new area and they can gain new relationships and reach out more. But I've noticed that that's really helped as well, because there is such a wanted need for reverence in my generation. We want it. We're craving it, though we don't always know that. And even though Mass is Mass, and that's important, and the Novus Ordo is valid and everything, and you do a wonderfully beautiful Novus Ordo, and I've gone to beautiful Novus Ordos before, but those are very rare. You just don't find that all the time. And if you do find it, it's usually hush hush, nobody wants to know about it, or nobody tells about it, because then you get ratted out to somebody and, people complain. There's this whole thing. We had that at one of my parishes, and now unfortunately it's modernized. Like they've dropped Jesus and nobody picked him up. Like he was just there on the floor until after communion, and then somebody came in with a napkin and picked him up. Yeah, you could see our faces right now. Well, they can't see our faces right now, but it's just utter disgust, because it's like, how are we supposed to believe in the true presence if the priest is struggling to believe? And I think that priests especially need our prayers. I'm not saying this is all priests or anything, but all priests need our prayers. But I'm not saying all priests are irreverent or they don't believe in, but I do think they're struggling, these days, because they don't have a great church community. Having that community is really important, because parishioners affect the priest and the priest affect parishioners, and there's this roundabout. And so it's kind of like that saying, like, you are who you attract, kind of, or you are what you eat and stuff. So if you're constantly around parishioners, especially boomer parishioners, no offense, but you know what I'm talking about, who are always complaining about things. This isn't always boomers, this is young people too, but they're always complaining about, like, oh, it's not modern enough, and there's guitars at mass and things like that. And so the priest will try to accommodate to bring more people in, but in reality, what we want is reverence and a backbone. We don't want everything conform to what we want, because it's not about us, it's about God and what is due to him, and reverence and the mass. And I think when we start making it about us, we lose that reverence and we lose that belief in the true presence. I don't know, I went on a ramble there, but maybe that, I don't know.
No, I mean, that's all fair, very fair points. And I told you this too, in the last couple of days, that, we had our priest convocation for my diocese last week. And our specific topic that we were presented on, one, we got to hear from Dr. Brant Petrie, who is always been just my favorite scripture theologian for the last 12 years now. Professor of mine at the seminary, also my second cousin once removed. So he talked specifically about the Eucharistic Revival that the USCCB is doing for the next 3 years. It was just amazing, for the priests of my diocese. Like, you could tell everybody was bought in to what was happening. And, we'd had the conference on the Eucharist, and we had 3 conferences total. We'd have a conference on the Eucharist, then we'd go into a communal holy hour, or we go into mass and then holy hour in the evening, like, depending how the schedule was. But like, you could tell, like, in that first communal holy hour that we had, just like the renewed sense of devotion we all had to the Eucharist. Like, you could just feel it in that chapel at the retreat center. And it was a really beautiful thing, and so, I think that is very important for us as priests, is for us to, and this was the phrase that we all kept, that really struck all of us, was the sense, and we heard this from the last 3 popes, talk about establishing the sense of Eucharistic amazement, and continuing, and the Pope saying specifically for priests to continue to foster Eucharistic amazement in ourselves, because if we're not amazed by the Eucharist, how do we expect anybody else to be?
Right.
And they say that specifically to us because, think like my situation, I'm at the cathedral of my diocese, which is a sacrament factory, because it's such a big parish. It's the mother church of the diocese. It's like, for me, like on Sunday mornings, I'll have 3 masses back to back to back, 7, 9, 11. And it's a marathon, and it's very difficult sometimes to prayerfully enter into that 11 o'clock mass when you feel like you've repeated yourself over and over again. You give the same homily, and sometimes you feel like you're talking to a wall sometimes, and you don't know how things are received, or you're being dive bombed by pigeons like I was this past Sunday, which was a whole nother story. It was the worst mass ever. The most memorable for sure, but I don't know how I got through that. They literally like swooped right at me. So.
No, I know you said about like cultivating that amazement for the Eucharist. Like, was there any specific tips that he gave that like the lay people can use? Because I know for me, myself, and my three pigeons inside of me, my 3 brain cells, that I've struggled with this, a lot, because of the fact that even though I reverted back, and I was raised in the faith and I grew up with devotion, coming back after, being introduced to the world and stuff like that, it can be very hard to believe in stuff like that, because of the fact it really relies on faith and trust. It's not something that I guess you're just automatically going to be like, oh yeah, that's Jesus, and you believe it. You might say that, but it really takes like understanding the Eucharist and things like that so did he give any tips on how to cultivate that for?
That's exactly what you just said. It's and I'll phrase it specifically this way. It's understanding the mysteries we celebrate. And the reason I say it that way is because, and this is the short way he said it, the mystery is in the history. This is what's called mystagogical catechesis, and this is a way that Jesus taught. He's famous for his parables, but if you look at the other primary method that Jesus teaches is by mystagogical catechesis. And what that means is that he goes back through salvation history. He goes back to the Old Testament. And look, we just celebrated, this is Valentine's Day. Currently, we're recording this 2 days ago on Sunday was the continuation of the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel. And you heard him repeat the phrase, "You have heard it was said X, but I say," and so that's mystagogical catechesis. When he says, "You have heard it was said," he's going back to something in the Old Testament. He's making allusions to these things. He'll say, like in John 6, it was not Moses who gave you your ancestors the bread, but it was my Father. So he's constantly going back and he's showing how he fulfills the law and the prophets, right? That's what he says in the gospel this past Sunday. He said, "I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." Right. So the idea is that the key to understanding even the Eucharist, especially the Eucharist, the key to understanding the mystery is to look back into the Old Testament, to look at the things that foreshadowed it, because the details that are revealed there help to make a lot more sense as to what we celebrate today. And that's in the Mass. You look at how much scripture is in the Mass, how much of it's Old Testament scripture, not per se New Testament. Some of it's New Testament. But there's a lot of Old Testament stuff in there, the way that we do things in our liturgy. And this is why I love the work that Dr. Petrie does, is because he goes back to the Jewish roots of everything. And that's kind of what he's known for. He's known as the Jewish roots biblical scholar at the Augustine Institute. And so that's what he does. And the whole point for us was to understand, what was Jesus trying to do? How was he fulfilling the Old Testament in such a way that he's showing us the trajectory of where we're going forward now?
Right. And it's interesting too, because typology, the fact of like finding those parallels between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but also the Old Testament and the Mass. Typology is not just for the Bible, it's also for the entire Catholic faith. There's so many parallels where, the foreshadowing of the Eucharist can be found in the Old Testament. Joseph, he gave the bread of life, quote unquote, when Egypt was going through, a famine. And
that's one of my favorite stories. Yep.
We love the rainbow code. I mean, I was raised on those stories as a kid, but I feel like as an adult, you don't really understand or grasp the importance or the typology of those things, because as a kid, you're raised on these Bible stories and things, and it's great. But, as an adult, we need to really I think we have a lot of holes in our understanding and our learning and our knowledge. And so because we don't have a sound foundation of what we believe, all of these mysteries are kind of a little bit rickety, so to speak. So when we have a better foundation, and the Eucharist is the pinnacle of our faith, that is why we are Catholic. And so if we understand that mystery, like you said, then everything else will kind of fall into place.
Yep. And not just, the mystagogical catechesis, but even just like paying attention to details in the scriptures and really and truly reflecting on these details. And I'll use an example he gave us. And this is the thing too, and he wrote a whole chapter in a big academic book on, if you look at the synoptic gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, the three of them associate the Last Supper with a Passover meal. In John's gospel, Jesus is crucified on actually at the same time that the lambs were being sacrificed in the temple. So for John, the Last Supper is not the Passover meal proper. But if you look at if what John's saying is true, when you go and prepare the Passover, they take the blood of that lamb and they throw it on the altar. And because there's so many pilgrims, I think Dr. Petrie said there's at least 250,000 sheep that are slaughtered in that one day for the Passover to be eaten that night. He said, imagine how much blood that is. That it would back up, it would back up the drainage, because it would flow out from the east side of the temple,
right?
And then it would back up the drain so much because of that amount of blood that the priests were knee deep in blood. And then he said this. He said, imagine that, for Jesus, Jesus, he's just the one lamb. Right. He said, but imagine how many masses have been celebrated throughout the world. How much of Jesus's blood has been consecrated at the altar? And so when you think of it that way, you're like, wow.
Right.
And to me, that's Eucharistic amazement, is to reflect on how Jesus has taken that role now as the Passover lamb, and how much of his blood has been poured out for the forgiveness of sins,
Right.
and to say it's truly immeasurable, it's limitless, that Jesus has an unlimited amount of blood to pour forth for the world. And so that is how I feel like we really reclaim is really, again, by intentionally meditating upon details like that, to say that this is how the Passover was celebrated. This is how the lamb was slaughtered. And to look at those details and say, this is how Jesus did all this, and how meaningful that is.
And it's really important because I think a lot of the times we become desensitized. I think so many people these days are just desensitized to death and suffering and dying and things of that nature. So in a way, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but when we hear about, Christ dying on the cross for us, people are like, well, people die every day type thing. I've heard that argument a lot in my generation, where they're just like, okay, and like, people die every day, so what? And they don't understand the deepness, the details behind the significance of Christ's death, that he didn't just die, he resurrected. Everybody, I feel like, cuts it off there. They're just like, oh, well, he died for my sins. Okay. No, he also lived, like he came back. And for us to live our lives according to Christ, right, to follow God and his will, that is how we'll truly be fulfilled, and we'll start to truly understand our faith. If we only go to mass and we're only Catholics in church, but outside of church we're not, we're never going to get there. We're never going to understand that. And it's a process. It's not just something that happens overnight, but trying is what counts, and if we're only willing to be Catholics in church, we're never going to have that deeper understanding or relationship with God.
Yep, definitely.
So it's just interesting to me, but that's a great point. We love that. I mean, the Eucharist is just so amazing. And, I think back to some of what the original, the first Christians, I should say, said about, the Eucharist. And there was this one homily written in 244 AD, I believe it was, but it says, "You are accustomed to take part in the divine mysteries, so you know how, when you have received the body of the Lord, you reverently exercise every care lest a particle of it fall, and lest anything of the consecrated gift perish." And it was a homily based off of Exodus 13:3, and it's just interesting to me because I see how disrespected and irreverent the Eucharist is handled these days. And, my boyfriend, he goes to a quote unquote Catholic college. And there was this lady who obviously probably meant well, like she didn't know herself. But during communion, she went up to the, oh my gosh, what is it? The tabernacle.
Yeah.
And she took out, is it called the ciborium? Or is that okay?
Yeah.
She took it out and she started like flipping through like Jesus basically, and like touching the ciborium and the tabernacle. And it's just very irreverent, and it doesn't cultivate this belief in the Eucharist. It just feels like she's getting crackers from the cabinet, honestly. Like that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And the priest would just sit down and have the Eucharistic ministers do everything. And it can be very disheartening being a young adult and witnessing things like that, because when you truly believe in Christ and his presence in the Eucharist and that he's the King of Kings, there's just so many times where it's overwhelmed me how disrespected he is, by people who are Catholic. It's, you can be very I mean, I don't know how you would feel because you're an actual priest and you see people. I'm sure people, some of your parishioners are that way, and I'm sure it's disheartening for you as well. It's just crazy, absolutely crazy. Yep. But anyways, I guess that kind of wraps up our episode. We were talking for a while. Wow, look at that.
I know the time it really does fly whenever we do some of these kind of off the cuff episodes. And
we do. I kind of like the off the cuff episodes though, because I mean, like, we're friends and like we chit chat and like, we talk like almost every day and stuff, but like doing it on a podcast, I feel like it helps other people because they hear our crazy conversations. And
I feel like we pick each other's brains when we do this, which is cool, but I think that's what needs to happen is we need more Catholics, more young Catholics to to pick each other's brains, not in an antagonistic sense, but like I say, in the way that we do it, you and I all the time, is to ask each other questions, to talk about things. How do you think? What do you feel about this? What do you think about this?
It's just about having conversations. And I think
Yeah.
that's a lost art today. People don't know how to have conversations. It's always an argument or a disagreement or something. They can't just, even if like, I don't think we've ever disagreed on anything, but even if
No.
we were to, we would still just be like, okay, anyway, so like, it's just interesting how so many people look for like a fight these days.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
but it's crazy. Well, good luck on your active duty. By the time this episode airs, you won't be on active duty yet. It'll be like a month till, but definitely.
Don't remind me. Oh my goodness.
I know it's crazy, but I'm sure my listeners will keep you in their prayers as you
I
do
appreciate
this.
it. Definitely. Yep.
But you have any final words for the parishioners, Father Dan?
Parishioners, the listeners. It's always been a pleasure to do this with you, and I'm hoping I can say exactly what my schedule and work on active duty. Hopefully, time permitting, I'll be able to keep doing this once I'm on active. But if not, it's a great pleasure to do this. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a great pleasure to have you on as always, and we'll hope that the active duty goes well, and we'll talk to you when you get back, or we'll plan something, I'm sure.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Father Dan. And with all of that being said, that was Father Dan, the karate priest. You should follow him on Instagram. And he also has his own podcast, which you guys probably hear the ad for at the beginning of mine, because I always throw it in there because Father Dan's amazing. But yeah, with all of that being said, I hope you guys learned a little bit, and this was the end of season 3. So stay tuned for season 4 coming back in August. So I will talk to you guys then. Bye, guys.
'Tis the season to shine with H&M. Discover the holiday collection and find fashionable pieces for your wardrobe or for under the tree. Get inspired and dazzle with this year's glam. From tuxedo styles, bow detailed pieces, impressive prints, and more. From unforgettable looks to unforgettable gifts. With fashion finds to home decor, find it all at H&M. Treat your loved ones and yourself this season. Shop in-store or at hm.com.
Thank you so much for listening to A Catholic's Perspective with me, The Religious Hippie. Make sure to visit my official website at thereligioushippie.com, and while you're there, be sure to sign up for my newsletter to keep up to date with my latest news and offerings. You can also find me on virtually any social media site as The Religious Hippie. Thanks for listening.
A quest is a search for something. And every week, the Quest podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. I'm your host, Todd Fisher. Join me in this thought-provoking and inspiring podcast of discovery. Find us anywhere you listen to podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Selling a little or a lot? Do your thing however you cha-ching with Shopify, the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/offer23.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure and visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.